To the outside world, the daughters of ancient Egypt appeared to live lives most people could never imagine. They walked through halls covered in gold. They slept beneath painted ceilings that mirrored the stars. They wore linen softer than anything found beyond the banks of the Nile, and servants answered before they even spoke. To foreign ambassadors, merchants, and visiting nobles, the daughters of the Pharaoh were symbols of perfection, beauty, power, divine blood. But inside the palace, they were something else entirely. They were insurance. They were diplomacy. They were continuity. And above all, they were blood. Because in ancient Egypt, royal blood was never simply inherited. It had to be protected, preserved, contained, and sometimes that meant keeping it inside the family itself. From childhood, royal daughters were taught that they were not like other women. They were descendants of gods. Their father was not simply a king. He was living divinity. The palace priests repeated it. Their tutors repeated it. The servants treated it as unquestionable truth. And when something is repeated from birth, it stops feeling like instruction. It starts feeling like destiny. The young princesses learned multiple languages, sacred rituals, diplomacy, music, religion, and the complicated art of speaking without revealing what they truly thought. Because in the royal court of Egypt, words could start wars, but silence could preserve dynasties. As the daughters grew older, something else changed. Conversations stopped when they entered rooms. Priests began studying family records. Royal advisors began speaking quietly with queens. Marriage proposals from foreign kings arrived and disappeared. At first, the girls did not understand why. Why powerful rulers from distant lands could send gold, armies, and promises, and still receive no answer. But inside the palace, the answer was simple. Some blood was never meant to leave. And for the daughters of the Pharaoh, that truth would define everything. As the daughters of ancient Egypt grew older, the palace around them began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. The same servants who once laughed softly while braiding their hair now lowered their eyes when they entered the room. The same tutors who once spoke of poetry, astronomy, and sacred hymns now spent more time discussing lineage, ancestry, inheritance, and the responsibilities of divine blood. At first, the young princesses believed this was simply part of growing up. After all, they were daughters of the Pharaoh. Responsibility was expected. Ceremony was expected. Discipline was expected. But what they did not yet understand was that none of this preparation was about the outside world. It was not about diplomacy. It was not about foreign alliances. And it was not about one day leaving the palace to build lives of their own. It was about staying exactly where they were. Inside the palace archives, priests carefully maintained records stretching back generations. Names were studied. Births were recorded. Deaths were analyzed. Marriages were discussed not with emotion, but with precision. Certain bloodlines were praised. Others were quietly removed from consideration. And over time, the daughters began noticing something impossible to ignore. Powerful kings from distant lands continued sending gifts: ivory, gold, soldiers, exotic animals, and written promises of military alliance. But almost none of those proposals ever reached the women they were supposedly intended for. The gifts entered the palace. The letters were read. The messengers were honored. And then, silence. No celebration. No engagement. No departure. Only more waiting. Some of the younger princesses still dreamed. They imagined distant kingdoms, foreign cities, and husbands they had never met. They imagined crossing deserts, sailing rivers, and living beyond the walls that had defined their childhood. But older women in the palace, queens, royal mothers, and sisters who had lived through the same process, watched them with a silence that revealed more than words ever could, because they already knew the truth. And eventually, the daughters would know it too. The realization did not come during a ceremony. It did not come through an official announcement. It came in small moments. A conversation that suddenly stopped when they entered a room. A marriage scroll quickly hidden by a priest. A foreign ambassador leaving the palace with disappointment written across his face. And then one night, one of the older queens finally spoke. Not with comfort, not with apology, but with certainty. The blood of gods, she told them, does not belong to strangers. And in that moment, for the first time in their lives, the daughters of Egypt understood something terrifying. They had never been raised to leave the palace. They had been raised to preserve it. Once the daughters of ancient Egypt understood the truth, something inside them changed forever. The palace that had once felt limitless now felt smaller with every passing day. The marble corridors they had run through as children no longer felt beautiful. The painted ceilings that mirrored the stars no longer felt divine. Even the servants, people who had watched them grow from infancy, now seemed less like companions and more like witnesses. Because once a person realizes they are trapped, every familiar thing begins to look different. Some of the younger princesses refused to believe it at first. They convinced themselves that their mothers were exaggerating, that tradition would eventually change, that the rules applied only to older generations. Surely a pharaoh's daughter could choose. Surely divine blood meant freedom. Surely power meant options. But inside the Egyptian court, power rarely belonged to the people who appeared to possess it. Power belonged to priests who interpreted the gods, to advisors who studied succession, to queens who understood the cost of dynastic survival, and above all, power belonged to the system. The daughters began testing the boundaries in small ways. Some asked more direct questions during lessons. Some pushed tutors to explain why foreign proposals were always rejected. Some spent longer on palace balconies, staring at merchant ships moving along the Nile, imagining what life might look like beyond the stone walls of Memphis, Thebes, or the royal compounds that had shaped their entire existence. One princess even dared to ask her father directly, not as a politician, not as a daughter of Egypt, but simply as a daughter, "Will I ever leave this place?" The room reportedly fell silent. Advisors looked down. Servants stopped moving. Even the priests avoided eye contact. And the pharaoh, who commanded armies, moved nations, and was worshipped as living divinity, did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the answer even worse. "You were not born to leave," he said. "You were born, so Egypt never dies." For some daughters, that answer created obedience. For others, it created rebellion. Quiet rebellion. Dangerous rebellion. Secret letters. Forbidden conversations with guards. Hidden meetings with foreign translators. Small acts that, in any ordinary family, might have been forgiven. But in the house of the pharaoh, bloodline betrayal was never treated as family disobedience. It was treated as a threat to the gods themselves. Inside the royal courts of ancient Egypt, silence was not simply the absence of sound. Silence was policy. Silence protected priests, preserved dynasties, and erased mistakes before they could become stories. And nowhere was that silence more powerful than when one of the pharaoh's daughters refused the role she had been born into. At first, resistance rarely looked dramatic. There were no public confrontations. No screams echoing through golden halls. No visible rebellion. It began quietly. A missed lesson. A hidden conversation. A servant asked to deliver a sealed message. A glance held too long with a foreign diplomat. A name written where no name should have appeared. Small things. Human things. The kind of things that in another life might have led to love, freedom, or escape. But inside the house of the Pharaoh, small things were never just small, because the palace noticed everything. Servants talked. Guards observed. Priests remembered. And royal mothers, women who had survived the same system decades earlier, often understood what was happening long before the daughters realized they had been discovered. Some were warned. Quietly. Gently. With the kind of sadness only experience creates. Others were not given that mercy, because mercy, in matters of bloodline, could become weakness, and weakness could become succession crisis. Ancient Egyptian records rarely describe scandal directly. That was intentional. Official inscriptions were built to glorify dynasties, not expose their fractures. Victories were carved into stone. Failures were erased from it. But archaeological gaps, unfinished records, and names that appear once, then disappear entirely, suggest something historians have studied for generations. Some daughters simply vanished from succession lists. Some names stop appearing in temple donations. Some portraits were never completed. Some burial plans were abandoned without explanation. And in a civilization obsessed with memory, disappearing from the record was not just punishment. It was annihilation. Because for Egyptians, immortality depended on being remembered. To remove a royal daughter's name was not merely to control her future. It was to control her eternity. Some may have been sent away to remote temple compounds. Some may have lived under religious supervision, far from politics, far from men, far from succession. Some may have disappeared into carefully arranged marriages that no longer carried royal titles. And some may never have left the palace alive at all. History does not always tell us which, but history does leave patterns, and those patterns suggest one terrifying truth. In the house of the Pharaoh, rebellion was not always answered with death. Sometimes it was answered with disappearance. By the time a daughter of ancient Egypt reached adulthood, she usually understood something few people outside the palace ever could. She had never been raised for herself. She had never been educated for independence. She had never been protected because she was loved more than others. She had been preserved because she was useful. And once that truth settled deep enough, something extraordinary began to happen. Some daughters stopped resisting entirely. Not because the system broke them, but because the system convinced them it was them. They stopped dreaming of foreign lands, stopped watching merchant ships on the Nile, stopped asking about ambassadors, proposals, and kingdoms beyond the desert. Instead, they became what the palace had always intended: advisors, queens, priestesses, mothers of future rulers, guardians of the bloodline. And in many ways, this was the most effective form of control the palace had ever created, because fear can force obedience for a time, but identity can secure obedience for generations. Some royal daughters eventually stood beside pharaohs during sacred ceremonies. Some controlled temple wealth. Some managed diplomatic marriages for younger relatives. Some decided which names would remain in the bloodline, and which would quietly disappear from it. And somewhere along the way, many of them stopped seeing themselves as victims. They became participants, protectors of the very machine that had once frightened them. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. Because when people ask what happened to the daughters of Egypt's pharaohs, they often expect tragedy, captivity, forced marriage, political sacrifice. And some of that is true. But the deeper truth is more complicated. They were not simply trapped inside the palace. Over time, the palace entered them. Its rituals became their rituals. Its priorities became their priorities. Its fears became their fears. Its survival became their purpose. So when the empire looked eternal, when the temples stood untouched, when dynasties survived generation after generation, people praised the pharaohs. They praised the armies. They praised the gods. But hidden behind those golden walls were daughters whose names history barely remembers, and whose obedience helped keep gods alive.